All right, y'all. So this is going to be a continuation into our investigation of what happened to the so-called Black European presence in Europe and how the Black Europeans of the medieval time period into the Renaissance time period and even a little bit further down the line lost their rulership in Europe. And in the last video, of course, I talked about the cataclysmic event known as the Black Death that killed off as much as 60% of the medieval European population, and even something like 30 to 40% of the population in places like Great Britain. So yeah, that took out a lot of the medieval Europeans' numbers, and as I was able to show, even a lot of the nobility of that time period fell victim to the Black Plague, especially noblewomen like Joan of England and her family member Philippa of Lancaster, as well as Anne of Bohemia and her sister Margaret, so on and so forth. And from what I showed, all of those women, and even the one nobleman that I mentioned, Louis the First of Naples, they were all so-called black. So the Black Death took out a lot of the original so-called black population of medieval Europe, and with the removal of the blacks of Europe came the introduction of the Caucasian man in the form of the wild man of the woods, coming into Europe and taking over as the preeminent force. Now, that's not to say that there weren't any Caucasians in Europe at all until the wild man arrived. There were a good number of Caucasians that lived in medieval Europe who even had titles of nobility, but the vast majority of the regular peasant class and even noble class of medieval Europe was comprised of so-called blacks. And we'll see that this is indeed a valid statement the more I delve into the medieval time period. But the point of this video is to further discuss and take a look at how the Black Europeans lost their rulership, and we'll do this by looking at a pivotal event in not just European history, but world history overall. That also had a huge impact on, again, so-called Black people's rulership in Europe, and this event is known as the Protestant Reformation. And the reason why it is important to understand the impact that the Protestant Reformation had is because of the upheaval that it caused in Europe when the idea of Protestantism was introduced in the early 1500s. I believe around 1517 is when the ideology was officially introduced into Europe. And for those of you who don't know what Protestantism is, or what being a quote unquote Protestant is, it's basically a denomination of Christianity that acted as an alternative and even opposition of Catholicism, and its core beliefs that were centered around the Pope having universal authority over the church and his congregants. And they also believed that the power of the Pope, as well as the Catholic Church in and of itself, was too great, and that the Bible should be considered the only source of knowledge and power for believers. And they also believed that all believers should have access to the Scriptures, which was something that the Catholic Church did not allow. They didn't allow other people who weren't bishops or priests or what they called friars to have much access to the Bible in terms of them being able to read it on their own. And the Protestants thought that this was wrong, and that all believers should be able to read the Bible for themselves. So the ideology of Protestantism, which was credited to have been started by a man by the name of Martin Luther, who was a man that a lot of you may have heard of his name before in your history classes as, kids or whatever. But yeah, Martin Luther was the one who started the Protestant Reformation, which exacerbated even more when he created his disputation in the powers of indulgences, or which is more famously known as the 95 Theses, which was a series of 95 ideas about the Christian faith that he invited people to try and debate him on. And most of his ideologies ran completely contrary to the teachings of the Catholic Church, which led to him being excommunicated or kicked out from the Catholic Church by Pope Leo X after Martin Luther refused to denounce his teachings within the 95 Theses. The teachings that Martin Luther espoused ended up spreading all throughout his home country in Germany, and even to different areas in Europe like France, where the French theologian John Calvin started to teach Protestantism in his own home country. And then it also spread to places like Switzerland, the Netherlands, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, Hungary, Latvia, Estonia, and into the British Isles, and then which includes places like Scotland, Ireland, and Wales. And then most importantly, England. England became heavy practitioners of Protestantism, and the reason why I emphasize England is because through the conversion of King Henry VIII, who was a so-called black man, by the way, but that will be another story for another day. But through his conversion to Protestantism, because of him being incensed by Pope Clement VII, who would not grant him his divorce from his then wife Catherine of Aragon in favor of marrying his mistress Anne Boleyn, who again, Anne Boleyn, she was also a so-called black woman. Her, along with Catherine of Aragon, as well, they were They were both so-called black women, but again, that will be for later. But through this conflict between Henry VIII and Pope Clement VII is what led to Henry's separation from the Catholic Church and him becoming a Protestant. And this is what really led to or this is what started the trend of Protestantism becoming widespread all throughout Europe. And from there, the conflicts between monarchs that espoused Protestantism and monarchs that were still in favor of Catholicism still. This led to some of the most destructive and divisive wars in European and really world history, which, like I stated, this divided and led to a lot of upheavals that caused conflicts to happen amongst the black ruling elite of Europe at the time. One of the major destructive conflicts that the Protestant Reformation caused was known as the 80 Years' War. So let's take a look at the 80 Years' War and the impact that it had. So the 80 Years' War was a conflict that ensued between Spain and the Netherlands, or the Dutch. And this conflict mainly was between Philip II of Spain and William I of Orange. And before I move on with this conflict, I just want to emphasize and reinforce again that these people were indeed so-called black. Philip II of Spain, who was the son of Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire, he was a so-called black man, along with William I of Orange. And I just want to pause real quick here and take a look at some proof to show that this is indeed true. So we're first going to take a look at Philip II of Spain, who will be talked about much more when I do my series on the Holy Roman Empire and the House of Habsburg. But Philip II of Spain, as I already stated, was indeed a so-called black man. And one of the main pieces of evidence to prove this comes from the Inca Kings List, which was a manuscript that was created during the 18th century or the 1700s. So it was made a little bit after the time period of Philip II's reign, but we'll get some depictions of him that back up this portrayal of him in a minute. But anyway, as we can see from this Incan genealogical list, Philip II is unquestionably depicted here as a so-called black man. He's the one whose name is listed as Felipe II, by the way, which means just Philip II. And if and even if you look back to the first European-born king on this list, who was Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire, who was also the father of Philip II of Spain, you can clearly see that he is also portrayed as a so-called black man too. And, please don't come in my comments talking about how all these faces just got darker over time when there are clearly two so-called Caucasian Catholics who are depicted at the very top of the chart. And they clearly look distinct from the Incan rulers as well as the European kings. Now, wait a minute here. Wasn't all of Europe supposed to be inhabited by so-called Caucasians during this time? Why are there people of color that are painted here on this chart who are kings and rulers that when you look up their names, it tells you that they ruled over Spain and the Netherlands and France and Germany, Poland, etc. All of those countries were supposed to be Caucasian, right? Inhabited and ruled over by Caucasian kings like Charles V and Philip II and the various other successors of theirs that ruled in Europe. So why are they depicted as people of color? And even besides that, when you look back up at the top of this chart, even Christ is depicted as a man of color or as a so-called black man. But I thought the Europeans only depicted Christ as a Caucasian to take on the supposed appearance of what they looked like at the time. So why is Christ also depicted as a so-called black man? If Europe was predominantly Caucasian at this time. Okay, so that's a lot of questions that need to be answered, but we'll just stick to what we know so far, which is that Philip II of Spain is clearly depicted as a so-called black man right here. And not only him, but all of his descendants and successors are portrayed as men of color. Now, I'm going to jump a little bit ahead here and talk about something that is going to be heavily talked about later on in this series, and that's the fake fabricated versions of manuscripts or sculptures or art pieces that get made to try and completely conflate historical narrative. And a very, very good example of this is the redone version of this chart right here. That shows all of the European kings as lighter skinned. And you can see right here that this is a stark contrast to the original chart that we just took a look at. Just look at Philip II of Spain right here on the bottom left. He's far lighter than the Philip II of Spain of the original chart that I showed. And you can clearly see that this chart has been remade because the faces are far more modern and the design of the image itself is far more modern than the first one that I showed, as if it was just painted recently. But certainly it was painted after the original one that I showed. And whoever painted this obviously was given the license to change as much as possible. Even Christ, when you look at it, who we just saw previously in the last image, was painted as a so-called black man, but in this image they made Christ a so-called Caucasian. And this is why even to this day we look at an image of a guy with long reddish or blonde hair and blue eyes with a big beard as being so-called Jesus Christ, because the Caucasian has changed the image of Christ. Okay, the original images of Christ that depict what he looked like, not necessarily while he was alive, because there are no known portraits that exist of him while he was living, but the old Roman catacombs depictions of him show that he was clearly a man of color, or a so-called black man. But that will be for another day. But just getting back to Philip II of Spain again, originally he was portrayed as a so-called black man because that is what he was, along with every last king or emperor that is depicted on this chart. If you don't believe me, still I'll show a quick example of how accurate this portrait is. Okay, so at the very bottom of the chart, there is an emperor that is shown, and his name, as it's listed on the chart, is Charles III, who was the ruler of Spain. He was also the Duke of Parma and the King of Sicily. And as we can see, he is depicted as a man of color on this chart. But let's see if this is how Charles III of Spain was actually described, so that once again we can vet this chart to make sure that it is indeed accurate, and how it portrays the European kings and emperors. So here is a description of Charles III of Spain that was written in and around the same time of his reign as King of Spain. So let's read how he is described here. So Don Carlos III, King of Spain, September 11th, 1759. So this entry obviously is in reference to Charles III of Spain. So let's skip down and look at this description right here. So in person, he is middle-sized, round-shouldered, large-boned, of a dark brown complexion, has small eyes and a very large prominent Roman nose. Okay, so obviously, as we can see here, Charles III of Spain was described by a contemporary source as being a man with a dark brown skin complexion. And when we look back at the original Incan King's chart, which was actually made around his reign as King of Spain, I believe, but when we look at how he is portrayed, he is more than accurately depicted with dark brown skin. But then the description also stated that he had a quote-unquote Roman nose, which was just another way of saying he had a quote-unquote aquiline or long nose. And in the chart, we can see clearly that he is depicted with an aquiline or long nose as well. So again, this chart is accurate in how it depicts each of these emperors, including, of course, Philip II of Spain. So again, Philip II was a so-called black man. But let's just take a look at a few more portraits that were actually made during his life. So this is a bust of Philip II of Spain that was made during the latter portion of the 16th century or 1500s, which again is right in line with when Philip II of Spain lived. So this is a more than credible source for how he looked. And again, it is obvious that he is shown to be a so-called black man. You can even see the curly woolly hair that he has, and also the thick lips, along with the famous Habsburg jaw, which none of the alleged descendants of the Habsburgs today have, by the way. But this bust clearly shows Philip II of Spain as a so-called black man, just like the Incan King's chart did. So let's just take a look at one last contemporary depiction of Philip II of Spain, and then we'll move on to William I of Orange. So this is an authentic coin of Philip II of Spain, which again shows him to have had a so-called negroid-looking face, or negroid features, with the flat nose, thick lips, and same curly hair that we saw from the bust image. And since we already know what his skin color was, thanks to the Incan King's chart, we can safely say that Philip II of Spain was indeed a so-called black man. And there are many, many other different depictions of Philip II of Spain, as well as his father Charles V and other members of the Habsburg family, that show them as so-called black. But we'll take a look more at that later on in another series. But now let's just quickly move on and take a look at William I of Orange and see how he was described. The description I'm going to read of William I of Orange, the other major figure that was involved in the 80 Years' War, comes from a person who actually knew him and saw him in person. So now let's read how he describes William I, Prince of Orange. So Emmanuel van Meteren, who certainly knew the prince, so again, this is someone who actually knew what William the First of Orange looked like, but who certainly knew the prince, writes, he was a well-built man, taller than the average, with brown complexion and beard. Okay, so according to this person who was a Flemish historian and consulman during the time period of William the First's life, and once again knew William the First of Orange and saw him in person, he describes William the First as having a brown complexion. Okay, a brown complexion, not unlike the type of complexion that we saw Philip II of Spain having from the Incan Kings list chart. And when we look down in this book, there is yet another contemporary source that lived during William the First of Orange's lifetime, who states again that he was of a brown complexion. And then when we look a little bit further down the page, yet another description of William the First of Orange is given, and it states that William had a face that was rather dark than fair, i.e. his face inclined more to the dark or brown complexion than a fair or light complexion. So William the First of Orange was indeed a man of color, which makes it perplexing as to how he could be depicted like this in this portrait right here that clearly shows him with a fair or light complected face. But we just read from an actual contemporary of his that he was way more dark or brown skinned than he was fair skinned. So how could this be accurate? How could even a portrait like this, which once again portrays him having a fair complexion, be accurate when we just read that he was of a brown complexion and that his face was more dark than fair? So none of these portraits that are actually meant to depict William the First of Orange can be accurate and are just more examples of the fake redone images that get made of these noble figures so that the narrative about the nobility of Europe being Caucasian can persist. But in the case of William the First of Orange, there is an accurate portrayal of him that exists, which depicts him as he would have looked in real life. Here it is right here, and as we can see in this, what's called an engraving, William the First of Orange is depicted with a curly-haired afro and clearly has the appearance of a so-called black man. And when we combine this image of William the First of Orange and the descriptions that were given of him by contemporary sources that say that he was a man of brown complexion, it should be obvious that Prince William the First was indeed a so-called black man. So now that we've established that two individuals who were responsible for the 80 Years' War happening were so-called black, we can now establish that this war was one of the religious conflicts that happened during the 16th or 17th century that caused the downfall of so-called black rulership in Europe. And so now let's see why this was. So the causes of the 80 Years' War had to do with, of course, the Protestant Reformation and the conflicts that ensued from its establishment. Spain had complete control over the areas of Europe that were known as the quote-unquote Low Countries, which included Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands, which is the main area that we're going to focus on. And so Philip II, who was a devout Catholic, passed laws that were geared towards persecuting Protestants within the Netherlands, and by now Protestantism had become very widespread all throughout the Netherlands, mainly by people known as Anabaptists, along with the acolytes or the followers of John Calvin. And by the 1560s, tensions had become very high between Catholics and Protestants, which eventually led to the 80 Years' War, which started during the late 1560s, around the year 1566 or 1568. The 80 Years' War would last from 1568 to 1648. And of course, both Philip II of Spain and William the First of Orange didn't live throughout this entire war. As a matter of fact, Philip II of Spain put a bounty on the head of William the First of Orange, which prompted a man by the name of Balthazar Gerard to assassinate him in July of 1584. And once Philip II of Spain died, he was succeeded by his son, Philip III of Spain, who picked up where his father had left off in the 80 Years' War. And just keep in mind that Philip III of Spain, according to the original Incan Kings list chart, was also a so-called black man, just like his father. But that goes without saying after the evidence that I showed of his father, Philip II, being a so-called black man. But it's just good to keep that in mind. But anyway, William the First of Orange was succeeded by one of his sons named Maurice of Orange, who of course was also a so-called black man like his father. But Philip III of Spain and Maurice of Orange wouldn't be the last monarchs that participated in this conflict. After Philip III of Spain died, he was succeeded by his son, Philip IV of Spain, who once again was a so-called black man. And after the death of Maurice of Orange in 1625, he was succeeded by his brother, who was of course also a son of William I of Orange, who was named Friedrich Henry of Orange. The end of the war resulted in a victory for the Dutch, who became recognized as their own independent republic, along with other Low Countries in Europe like Belgium and Luxembourg. But the cost of life from this conflict resulted in 100,000 to 500,000 total people dead. Both civilians and soldiers were included in this death toll as well. And then also the separation that was caused by the initial reason for this war starting in the first place, which was the Protestant Reformation, was the most long-lasting drawback of the 80 Years' War. And as destructive and desecrating to the overall state of Europe this war was, there is a war that was also started by the Protestant Reformation that was far more destructive and divisive towards the overall state of Europe, both from the separation that ensued during the due to the differences in ideology, as well as the grave loss of life that it caused. This conflict was known as the 30 Years' War. So let's take a look at what the lasting legacy of the 30 Years' War was, and how it ultimately affected so-called black rulership in Europe. Okay, so the 30 Years' War is one of the more well-known conflicts in European history, mainly because of how destructive it was to the overall population of Europe, as well as the division that it encouraged amongst other major European empires, one of which we'll take a look at in a minute, which took place in England and led to another so-called black royal family's downfall from their rulership. But again, we'll take a look at that in a little bit here. But anyway, the 30 Years' War is something that oftentimes is separated into different sections or phases because of a lot of the upheaval that happened during the short span of time. The first phase that occurred was the Bohemian Revolt phase, which was caused by the same root cause of the vast majority of these conflicts, that being, of course, the Protestant Reformation. Ferdinand II of the Holy Roman Empire, who of course was also a so-called black man, as you can see by this coin right here, and even by this medallion that depicts the natural-born daughter of Ferdinand II of the Holy Roman Empire, and his wife Maria Anna of Bavaria. His daughter right here is clearly shown as a so-called black woman. So it's no surprise there. We should already get the message of how, by now, that the rulership of Europe during this time period was predominantly so-called black. But I'll keep reiterating this all throughout this series anyway, so that you guys can visualize, these people as they truly were and how they truly look like, and not how they're propagated to be in the mainstream. But anyway, Ferdinand II of Spain, or Ferdinand II, became the ruler of Bohemia in 1617. And this incensed the Bohemian population, which was largely Protestant, as opposed to Ferdinand II, who, like a lot of his predecessors before him, was Catholic. And this led to something that became known as the Bohemian Revolt, which was the initial start of the 30 Years' War itself. The Bohemian Revolt, which was led by Friedrich V of the Palatine, who, yes, was also a so-called black man as well. He was the husband of one of the daughters of King James VI/I, who was named Elizabeth Stuart, who, when you take a look at this coin right here of her, you can clearly see that she was a so-called black woman as well. But together, she and Friedrich V had a lot of children, and most of these children were called from the mouth of Elizabeth Stuart herself, quote unquote, black babies. I believe she called her sons Friedrich Henry, Charles I Louis, and Prince Rupert of Rhine, along with one of her daughters, Elizabeth of the Palatine, black babies. And yes, it was indeed a reference to their skin color. Okay, but I'm not going to go too deep into that right now, because I want to save that for later on when I talk about the Stuarts, in their own independent series. But yeah, Elizabeth Stuart literally wrote letters to her father, King James VI/I, calling her children black babies, and they were all said to have derived their exceedingly dark skin complexion from Friedrich V of the Palatine. So again, Friedrich V of the Palatine was indeed a so-called black man. But anyway, Friedrich V was elected to lead the Bohemian forces against Ferdinand II, but he was ultimately defeated at the Battle of the White in 1620, which would effectively end the Bohemian Revolt phase. But now the next phase will be initialized, which would see the introduction of Denmark into the equation of the 30 Years' War, and would commence the Denmark phase within the 30 Years' War narrative. Denmark came into the fray of the 30 Years' War in 1625, and they were led by Christian IV, King of Denmark, who again, yes, he was also a so-called black man as well, as we can see from this portrait of him that's held in the Hanseatic Museum in Norway, which he also was the king of, by the way, if I'm not mistaken. Christian IV was the king of Norway as well, but yeah. I mean, it's obvious that this is a so-called black man right here. And this portrait right here differs greatly from most portraits that you'll find of Christian IV if you go and look them up for yourself. And this is how you know that this is indeed the real image. But you can even look down the line of Christian IV of Denmark's ancestry at, figures like Dorothy, the Duchess of Prussia, and you can clearly see that she too was a black woman, as she's portrayed in this image. And again, there have been attempts to even lighten her portraits as well in the form of this portrait right here. Okay, so you can clearly see that this looks completely different from the original one that I just showed, right? So, but again, we'll get into the falsification of history that they've perpetuated through artwork and things of that nature later on. But anyway, Christian IV of Denmark partnered with Frederick V of the Palatine and supplied Frederick V with weapons and manpower along with other resources. Christian IV found himself pitted against a Catholic mercenary leader named Albrecht von Wallenstein, who was hired by Ferdinand II, and he was never able to get the better of the mercenary leader and ended up having to come to terms with him through a peaceful withdrawal from fighting around 1629. And then about a year later, Sweden entered into the mix of the war, and they were led by Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden, who was one of the greatest kings of Sweden in their history. And yes, Gustavus Adolphus was indeed also a so-called black man. But I don't want to keep beating you guys over the head with this, so I'll just leave it at that for right now, because it should be more than understood by now, just off of the rudimentary evidence that I've presented, that most of the nobility and royalty of Europe during this time period was indeed so-called black. So I'll just take a break from reminding you guys of that for a while, and also because most of this information will be displayed in far greater detail when I do my independent series on these figures. But anyway, Gustavus Adolphus entered into the 30 Years' War around the year 1630 with about 20,000 soldiers along with him, which was far fewer than the amount of soldiers his opposition had, but he was more than able to make up for it by introducing a bevy of military evolutions that helped the Swedes gain decided advantages over his opposition. And but Gustavus will be involved in the war until November of 1632, where he was killed going head to head with Albrecht von Wallenstein and Wallenstein's armed forces at the Battle of Lutzen. And Adolphus's army, they won the battle anyway under the command of Bernard of Saxe-Weimar, and Wallenstein was removed from command and was replaced by Cardinal Infante Ferdinand of Austria, who was the governor of the Spanish Netherlands, and he ended up defeating the combined Swedish and German coalition at the Battle of Nordingland in 1634. And so this leads into the last phase of the 30 Years' War, which was the French introduction into the war. And by now, the effects of the 30 Years' War were made evident all throughout Europe, through farmlands having been destroyed, which inevitably led to a wide-scale famine, causing, of course, many people to die of hunger, and civilians became uneasy by the lack of food and other resources, which led to them robbing and killing one another for food and resources that they could sell for money. And the war would eventually end in 1648 when King Ferdinand III agreed to peace negotiations, which led to the treaty known as the Peace of Westphalia. And so, but even though the war, even though everything was over by now with the war, in terms of fighting, the lasting effects of the war resulted in over 4 million people being killed, and some even estimate about 4.5 to 8 million in total were killed from countries like Sweden, Bohemia, Spain, Denmark, Austria, England, France, etc. And so, as I stated earlier in this video, this war, along with the 80 Years' War, are just two examples of the various conflicts that happened during this time period, which resulted in the population of Europe that was predominantly so-called black to dwindle greatly. And conflicts like these also acted as precursors to the black nobility in Europe, ultimately taking themselves out of their positions of prominence, as well as lessening their influence over the citizens that they ruled over, who were growing tired of the power that the nobility had over them. But we'll see in the next video how this all came to a head and who initiated the end of the monarchical rule in Europe. But one last example I want to talk about of the black nobility in Europe lessening their power and influence, as well as even taking their own family members out of power due to disputes over things mainly revolving around the genesis of most of the disputes that occurred during this time period, which was the Protestant Reformation, and the differences of opinion that a lot of the ruling elite had pertaining to whether they fell on the Catholic or Protestant side of the spectrum. But anyway, this last conflict that I'll talk about was known as the Glorious Revolution, and this was a conflict that ensued mainly amongst the Scottish royal family known as the Stuarts, who most know as the family that King James VI/I derived from and started the famous, or rather infamous, Stuart dynasty in England. But let's take a look. Let's talk a little bit about the Glorious Revolution before I close out this video. So the Glorious Revolution was a conflict that started due to, once again, disputes over the Catholic and Protestant denominations of Christianity. The main figures in this conflict were King James II/VII, who was the son of Charles I of England, who before James II became king, had started an upheaval amongst the realms that he ruled over, which some could say acted as a precedent for what James was about to go through. But James VII/II came into contact with his own daughter, Mary II, and her husband, who of course was his own son-in-law, and his name was William III of Orange, and he was a descendant of one of the men that I mentioned earlier, who was involved in the 30 Years' War, William I of Orange, who I was already able to show and prove that he was in fact a so-called black man, as we can see here in this engraving of himself. He was of course described as being of a brown complexion, right? And coincidentally enough, so was the present figure that we're discussing right now, William III of Orange. And I just want to show that real quick here before I move on even further. So this is a book that was written a little bit after the life of William III, but not so long to where a more than accurate description of him can't be gleaned from in this excerpt. I believe this book was originally published in 1758, and William III died around the early 1700s and lived throughout the mid to late 1600s. So again, this book can still give us a more than accurate depiction of King William III. So let's just read what this has to say right here. So King William was of a brown complexion, had a Roman nose and a lively piercing eye. Okay, so we can see King William III was described as having a brown complexion, just like his ancestor William I of Orange, who was described by many during his lifetime and even by William III himself as being a man of very dark skin complexion, more specifically of brown skin complexion. Okay, and we already have an accurate portrait of him right here that clearly shows us that he was a so-called black man. So if this is what William III's ancestor looked like, and if William III himself was described as having pretty much the same skin color as William I, then I think it should be clear that William III was indeed a so-called black man. You guys, all of these nobility figures that I'm talking about, regardless of how they're portrayed in the media or on TV shows or movies, all of these people were so-called black. Anybody who's refuting that by now, after seeing my first two installments of this series, are just in denial. But once again, this stuff is just the tip of the iceberg for what we're going to see when I really get into the medieval time period and even post-medieval time period in Europe. But anyway, getting back to the point. So yes, William III was the other figure involved in the Glorious Revolution, and he became introduced into this conflict due to the misgivings that Parliament had with James II over him being an adherent to Catholicism. The tensions between Catholics and Protestants was still very high, and given the history England had with this conflict between the two parties, going all the way back to Henry VIII and even to James II's grandfather, King James VI, Parliament, who mainly was Protestant, did not want to have to deal with this conflict again, which led to them writing letters to William III of Orange to come and invade England to depose King James II, and in return they would give him their undying loyalty. But William III had already made plans to go to England anyway, and these letters only bolstered his desire to want to make the trip there, which is exactly what he did, arriving in November of 1688. And James II was ready for the rally that was being made by William III and had assembled his own army to meet William's army. But several of James II's men, along with some of his own family members, deserted him and ended up siding with William III, which led to James feeling forced to have to retreat into London. James even attempted to flee England altogether due to him fearing for his life that he would be assassinated, and so he made an attempt to flee, but he was eventually found and captured. But later that month in November, he was able to escape and made another attempt to flee this time to France, where he could reside comfortably with his Catholic cousin, who was the King of France at the time, who was Louis XIV. Who, by the way, Louis XIV, he was also a so-called black man. But I'll definitely get into his life narrative later on when I talk about the kings of France. But France is where James would live out the rest of his days, dying in 1701 in England, already having taken over the British, Scottish, and Irish thrones was King William III and Queen Mary II, and they had ruled from about 1689 to the year after King James II's death, which was 1702. And even though Mary II didn't get to be on the throne for very long due to her own death coming in 1694, but King William III reigned comfortably for 8 years after her. But the lasting legacy of the Glorious Revolution was that it was one of the most essential events that led to the dissolution of absolute rule in England, i.e. the dissolution of the so-called black rulership in England, as well as in Europe as well, or in general. And so with the enforcement of a document that has become known to history as the Bill of Rights, which was introduced during the reigns of King William III and Queen Mary II, and had essentially made it so that their power was far more restricted than any monarch that would come before them, and made them more subject to Parliament. And this was a direct result of a lot of the disputes that monarchs of the past, such as Charles I of England and even James II, had with attempting to dissolve Parliament and even trying to create a whole new Parliament that would be in full obedience to them. So this Bill of Rights document was the precursor to what will come later on during the time period of the French Revolution in 1789, which subsequent to that, of course, came Napoleon Bonaparte and his complete and total transformation of not just France, but all of Europe, which changed from the belief in an absolutist monarchy to the control of the country by a governing body. So yeah, all of these things, most of which I will go into depth on in my next video series pertaining to the French Revolution and that time period and how it affected the rulership of so-called blacks in Europe. But all of these events did in fact lead to the dissolution of the rulership in Europe that the black ruling elite had, and not just the kings and queens, but also the people who were known as being called people of peerage or rank in Europe. So these were people who were known as dukes, earls, lords, counts, viscounts, marquises, barons, duchesses, etc. They all had their powers lessened as well, to the point of them having very little to no power at all. I've already gone over to a degree what a lot of the nobility figures in Europe looked like on my little mini series on Charles II, which was entitled "Were Black People Just Slaves During the 17th and 18th Century or 17 and 1800s?" So if you want to look at that for more proof about the so-called black nobility of Europe during this time period, you can go ahead and do so. But I'll go over that in much greater depth later on in another series. But yes, the black ruling elite of Europe were starting to go through the process of having their power stripped away from them, and conflicts like the Glorious Revolution, along with the other conflicts that I mentioned earlier, were some of the initial steps into so-called blacks losing their rulership in Europe. And the Stuarts were a prime example of this. Their last ruler of England, Scotland, and Ireland came in the form of Queen Anne, who was also a daughter of King James the seventh/2, and was of course a so-called black woman. But let me just confirm this as to not be accused of making this up. So now let's read this little excerpt right here, and just to clarify, I have way more information on the true appearances of these figures, but again, those will be saved for a later date. But let's just read this right here to get an idea of what the last Stuart monarch, Queen Anne, was said to have looked like. So let's start at the top right here where it says Dorchester. So Dorchester, Salisbury, Taunton, and other towns. Claver normally went to the Crown, where for 4 shillings a year he subscribed to Wise Letters and other papers to keep abreast of all the news. Now he picked up a new edition of A Cat May Look on a Queen, a long satire in which its Whig author mocked Queen Anne's pretended virtues and dark complexion. The writer sneered, "I'll praise no color but what resembles the night, and is 'tis Queen Anne's complexion." So pause real quick right here. So this excerpt is citing from a satirical short story, I believe, about Queen Anne that was written by a man by the name of, I believe, John Dunton, who did indeed live during the reign of Queen Anne. And so he most likely knew what Queen Anne would have looked like, especially someone who has affiliated with Parliament like John Dunton was. Okay, he was an affiliate of Parliament. So in this satire, John Dunton states that Anne had a complexion that was so dark that it literally resembled the night, which could have been an exaggeration, but nonetheless, it alludes to the fact that Queen Anne did indeed have a dark complexion, as this excerpt even states. But let's take a look at what else John Dunton had to say about Queen Anne here. He says, "'Tis sort of loyalty now to admire, or perhaps to look on, a black woman." I'm going to read that again. A black woman. So I can't make it any more clear than that. If you're still in denial concerning the nobility of Europe being so-called black, then have a nice day. But this is a clear and distinct description right here. Queen Anne of England was quite literally referred to as a black woman by someone who lived during her reign on the throne and time period of being alive. We know that her being called this was in reference to her complexion, because the author of this satire quite literally states this himself. So it's not due to her hair color or her eye color or the clothes that she wore or whatever other stupid reason or excuse some people who may be watching this video and might be trying to conjure up as to why Anne was called this might state. She straight up and down was a black woman who had a very dark complexion, okay? But if you still do not believe me, even though, like I said, you can go ahead and have a nice day if that's the case, but if you still don't believe me, let's take a look at one last example of a so-called black Stuart monarch, or I should say the last vestiges of the Stuarts who were trying to regain their place on the throne, but had already been supplanted by the Hanoverians, who were a mixed race royal house, but to a degree, they were still so-called black. But I'll get into that when I talk about guys like King George III and then even Queen Victoria later on. But yes, by now the Stuarts have been deposed by the Hanoverians, but they were still citizens within England. Or there were still citizens within England and throughout the various realms of Europe that the Stuarts ruled over, that wanted the Stuart line to be reinvigorated again. And these people are known to history as the Jacobites. And a lot of these Jacobites were men of nobility, which means that that a lot of them were so-called black men as well. Because once again, these so-called black men were still in rulership during this time period, even though their influence was starting to wane. And so the Jacobite movement, along with what came after it, which was the expulsion of a lot of these Jacobite rebels from the various countries that came from Europe, or that came in Europe to places like the Caribbean or even the United States of America, where they became indentured servants, which is something that we'll talk about more later on in this series. But the Jacobite rebellion is just one of the many events that occurred during this time period that indicated to the downfall of the black nobility, as well as the expulsion of so-called blacks out of Europe. But let's just read a few descriptions of this last monarch, who, by the way, was also the brother of Queen Anne, the black woman that we just read about. So let's see if these descriptions of her brother follow suit with how she was described. So now let's read this first description of the Stuart prince that was made by a noblewoman that lived during his time period of being alive. So now let's read what she has to say about James Francis Stuart. So James was reported to be a tall, lean, black man, looks half dead already, very thin, long-faced, and very ill-colored and melancholy. And then it goes on to give the person who wrote this description. This was obviously a woman of nobility, just judging by the title being, which was being a Countess of Lauderdale, which is in Scotland, I believe. And she wrote this description to another high-ranking person of nobility. But anyway, as we can see from this description, this noble woman referred to James Francis Stuart as a black man, right? Now, if I haven't already said it before, James Francis, or just simply James III, was a son of King James II, who himself, of course, was the father of Queen Anne of England, the same woman who I cited to have been a black woman, according to the satire that was written by the Whig participant John Dunton, and what he wrote about her. So now this isn't now isn't this interesting? Another member of the Stuart house literally being referred to as a so-called black person. Now, some people may try to state that just because James Francis Stuart was called a quote unquote black man, that doesn't literally mean that he was, of course, a so-called black man as we would think of one today. Well, so let's just put that theory to the test real quick by looking at a song that was written by that was written for James Francis Stuart, that by its very title hints at the complexion of James Francis. So let's take a look at that real quick. So this was a song that I believe was written by a Jacobite during the Jacobite rebellions, and you can see from the title of this song, it's titled "The Black Bird." Now, this song has a lot of symbology in it pertaining to James Francis Stuart and what he truly looked like, but I'll get more into detail about that when I do my series on the Stuarts. But let's just read a little bit about what this song says concerning the appearance of James Francis. So we'll start where it says "the Black Bird." So the Black Bird was one of the nicknames of the Chevalier de Saint George, and for those of you who don't know, this that title, Chevalier de Saint George, was a title that James Francis was known as. So that was in reference to him. But anyway, being suggested by his complexion, which was so excessively dark. Okay, so we can see here that this clearly gives us an understanding that this name given to James Francis is indeed in reference to his complexion. Okay, his skin color. So let's just make that perfectly clear right now. But reading on, it says, as to form a miraculous contrast with the light, fair countenance of his unfortunate son, Charles. So this also gives a bit of an allusion to the skin complexion of James Francis's son, Charles Edward Stuart, who was like the last bastion of royalty that the Stuarts had. And again, I will be talking about him as well as the entire Stuart clan when I do my independent series on them, on the Stuart family. But Charles Stuart was indeed of a lighter complexion, but he was not pale like this entry implies. As a matter of fact, his one and only daughter, who I believe was named Charlotte, was documented to have had a very dark complexion, and a lot like how James Francis is described as having right now. But Charles Edward Stuart was of a lighter complexion because that was around the time period where a lot of the black nobility started to intermix and intermingle with the other demographics that started to become a more prevalent force within Europe. Which caused a more quote-unquote mulatto-looking appearance to the nobility at the time. But again, that'll be for later when I go over that. But anyway, let's read the rest of this description. But skip down a little bit to where it says it would appear. So it would appear that the black complexion of the personage was a matter of great notoriety and was much harped upon by his parody as in a ring now in the possession of a Jacobite family in Forshire. There was a small parcel of his raven locks with this flattering proverbial inscription, "The black man's the bravest." So again, this Blackbird Jacobite song has a lot of symbology in it that would help someone figure out what the real appearance of James Francis Stuart was. But we'll look at that another time. But this should be pretty plain right here. This footnote description of the Blackbird song was clearly a song that was in reference to James Francis, and that name was a literal nickname. The Blackbird was a literal nickname that was given to him because of his complexion and how dark it was. This footnote goes as far as to say that James Francis had a literal black complexion. Okay, at the very end, we can see that at the very end, we see that the other word that was used to describe him from the last description that I showed, where we saw the word black man be used in reference to himself. We should know by now why he was called that, right? He was indeed a so-called black man, just like his sister Anne of England was described as a so-called black woman, literally. So it should be simple and plain by now, but if there are still detractors that doubt this to be true, let's take a look at a literal portrait of James Francis that will give us a visual representation of what he looked like. This right here is indeed a portrait of Prince James Francis Edward Stuart. But when you look up the description of this portrait, it will just say that it's some random mulatto aristocrat in a suit of armor. Just some random Negro that happened to be around and was an aristocrat in the 18th century in Europe. We don't know his name and we don't know where he comes from. It's just some random mulatto Negro that had their portrait painted by someone who, coincidentally enough, was actually the go-to principal painter of King James VII/II, who was, of course, like I stated before, the father of Prince James Francis Stewart. And I believe the painter's name was Francois de Troyes. But isn't that interesting? A random mulatto just happened to have their portrait painted by the primary court painter of James II, and of course his children as well. What a coincidence, right? And how we can tell that this is indeed James Francis Edward Stewart. There is a quote unquote whitewash painting that is almost an exact replica of this one right here, with the same kind of armor on and the same leopard print on the armor. If you can see it right there, you can see the leopard print or cheetah print scarf that's on his arm, standing, and then he's also standing in the exact same position as the original painting of Prince James III. Of course, here it is right here, but allegedly we're supposed to believe that the original portrait that I showed was just a random mulatto that again happened to have their portrait painted by the primary court painter of James Francis Stewart's father, King James II/VII. Now, based off of the descriptions that we just read from of James Francis, of him being a so-called black complexioned man, or even being just dark complexioned and literally being called a black man by an eyewitness account that saw him in person and even gave him a nickname to allude to his dark or black complexion, which one of these portraits do you think is more accurate? Let me know, because it's pretty obvious to me what the answer is. But again, you guys can let me know in the comments or something. But anyway, it should be obvious by now that one of the very last bastions of the Stuart royalty in England, and Prince James III, was indeed a so-called black man, as he was described, and even as his sister, Queen Anne of England, was described as well. And again, the Stuarts, along with the various dynasties that ruled different parts of Europe, from places like England, Scotland, Ireland, France, Spain, Italy, Poland, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, etc., will be talked about in their own independent series, because all of those rulers were so-called black. Okay. But anyway, I want to close this video out by looking at some of the nobles and even commoners who were advocates of the reinvigoration of the Stuart line on the throne of England, Scotland, and Ireland, all of which were being ruled over by the Hanoverians at the time, who, as I already stated, themselves were so-called black as well, but were the result of more heavy admixture with primarily so-called Caucasians. But I just wanted to take a look at some of these quote-unquote Jacobites and how they were described looking like, to even further prove my point about how the black nobility at the time, along with the common populace, were starting to come under siege, and were even being kicked out in relatively large numbers and transported to countries like the United States, Barbados, in the Caribbean, and various other places as well. And a lot of these exiles that were being kicked out of Europe are most likely the ancestors of some of you so-called black people who are watching this video right now. So pay attention to see if some of the people that I name have the same surname or last name as you, and people in your family, because that last name is your actual last name. It wasn't a name that was given to you by a slave master. Okay. But anyway, let's just take a look at a few of these things before we close out this video. So this is a pretty well-known document that gives an account of 150 Jacobite rebel prisoners who were shipped from England near the area known as Liverpool to a place in the Caribbean known as the Leeward Islands as a result of their participation in the rebellion against, I believe at the time, King George II. In favor of James Francis Stewart and the Stewart lineage being brought back on the throne. So let's just read what these quote-unquote Jacobite prisoners were described looking like. And once again, please pay attention to some of the last names to see if you have the same last name, because some of these people could possibly be an ancestor of yours who came from Europe, not as an African slave that was shipped from Africa to Europe and adopted a surname from their slave master, but all of these men and some women who were being listed on the census actually came from Europe and had lineages going back thousands of years in Europe. But let's read about some of them real quick. So we'll start at the very top and see the name Robert Adam, and he's described as being of a brown complexion, right? Being a brown complexion man. And just to clarify, if any of these descriptions simply have brown or black or ruddy or swarthy singularly by their name without any mention of hair or anything else, that is indeed in reference to their complexion or their skin color. Okay, so this sense is kind of weird because in some of the names it'll state complexion by the word that describes their color, but for most of them they'll just simply insert brown or black or even pale to describe the person's complexion. But again, this man, Robert Adam, is being described here as a man of brown complexion. And that last name, Adam, has its origins going all the way back to the Anglo-Saxons and even the original Scotsmen, who were, of course, so-called black. So here's him. And then as we go down, we can see the name Dougal Campbell. He's described as having a brown complexion. And interestingly enough, the word ruddy also pops up there as well. Now, I've already stated in the past, and I will continue to state that, and now I will continue to state this, and that's that the term ruddy, back during this time period and even during the Renaissance, medieval, and ancient times, was a word that was interchangeable with brown or a brown complexion, and it originally meant a sort of reddish brown color, and not what the purported meaning of it is today, which is a pale-faced person with a reddish undertone to their skin. So the word ruddy was a word that could mean anywhere from a light brown color to a very dark reddish brown color. Okay, but I'll eventually explain that as we go along with this whole medieval European series. But anyways, yes, this man Dougal Campbell was also described as being a man of brown complexion. And again, just looking at that last name, the name Campbell is of Scottish origin. And I know a lot of so-called black people have that last name Campbell, which is a name of great renown, by the way. A lot of notable figures in Scottish history came from the Campbell clan, and yes, they were all so-called black. So if you have that last name Campbell, that is more likely than not your last name, your real last name. You can see when you look down a little bit further at another man named John Campbell that he is also described as being a man of color as well. You can see that the term swarthy is by his name, implying a dark or so-called blackish brown complexion as well, which is what that term swarthy meant. So again, if you have that last name Campbell as a so-called black person, then that is more than likely your real last name that goes generations back into the Isles of Scotland. But moving on, we can see that Alex Davidson is described as ruddy, meaning a brownish color, as I already explained. And then Andrew Edwards is described literally as black. And for those of you who may not, or who may be just saying that he's called black because of his hair, again, this list as we go forward or as we go through it will specify when it's talking strictly about someone's hair color and not their skin color. Okay, we can see that with the second person on this list named William Bell, who was documented to have had black curled hair, specifying that his hair was the color black, or was his hair color was black. So again, if it will tell you when it's talking about hair color every single time, but as we can see here, this is clearly in reference to his complexion, with no mention of his hair. So this man was literally described as having a quote unquote black complexion. And then looking down, we can see that the men named Alex Goodbrand, John Grant, Alex Grant, John Hinchcliffe, John Johnson, and John Kennedy are described as brown and black. And all of those last names are mostly English and Scottish in origin. So again, those last names are a lot of you guys' real last names. And then further down, we can see Angus McIntosh, Peter McIntosh, James McPherson, and Alex McLeod. All are described with black and brown complexions. Pay attention to the last name, or to that last name McPherson, because that's going to be a name that we see another notable Jacobite participant later on having. But again, we can see another group of Jacobites being people of color, all having Irish last names. And then on the next page, we can see the names Don McGillis, Alan McDougall, Alex Marnock, James Nielsen, James Robertson, and Daniel Ross, described as being people of brown and black or swarthy complexions. And then further down, we can see William Robertson. Interestingly enough, someone with the Stuart clan, someone from the Stuart clan as well, can be seen being called ruddy, and James Lackey being described as black. George Bain, swarthy, another Stuart, being described as a person of color or brown and swarthy. So we should already know that the descendants of the Stuarts were so-called black just off of the montage that I showed thus far, right? And then John Thompson, who was black. Elizabeth Clavering is described as brown. Elizabeth McFarland is described as brown, as black and ruddy. Elizabeth Robb is described as brown. John Top is described as brown. James Thompson is described as having a brown complexion as well. And pay attention to the people who have the same last name being described as being of the same skin complexion, because we see it right here with John and James Thompson, which lets you know that a lot of the original Thompsons were so-called black, and a lot of so-called blacks that have that last name Thompson even today. You guys who have that last name, again, that most likely is you guys' real last name if you have that last name Thompson. But moving on to the next page, we can see more of the same Jacobite prisoners who are being referred to as brown or black or even swarthy in complexion. George Samuel, James Donald, Donna McDonald, Duncan Campbell. Once again, another member of the Clan Campbell, the Campbell clan, being described as having a dark complexion. And then I believe there's another Campbell on the list named Alex Campbell, and he too is also described as having a brown complexion. So again, members of the same clan who are described similarly, those are members of the same clan who are described similarly as having black or brown skin or dark skin complexions is a huge indicator that that particular clan, the Clan Campbell, was comprised of so-called black people. Okay, and then right underneath Alex Campbell, there is a man named George Hume, who was literally described as a black man. And he, I believe, was a writer that came from Edinburgh, which is in Scotland. So, once again, yet another so-called black Scotsman that did not come from Scotland as a slave, but rather as an Aboriginal Scotsman. But we should get the point by now, right? A lot of these Jacobite prisoners from this list were obviously so-called black, and were just one example of a copious amount of so-called blacks who were being shipped out of countries in Europe like Scotland, Ireland, England, Wales, Germany, France, Italy, etc. Which is how a lot of the black population diminished so much in those areas. But again, I will be discussing this even more later on in this series. But now that we've looked at some of the you could say quote unquote regular citizens who were Jacobites during the Jacobite revolt, let's take a look at a few nobility figures who were also Jacobites before I close this video out. So let's read this description of a Jacobite nobleman who was named James Talbot. So starting where it says Charles Wogan. So Charles Wogan was a man of taste and an excellent education. He it was who introduced Pope, a Catholic like himself, to the London wits. And for months, Charles with Colonel Oxburgh, James Talbot called from his black complexion the Crow. So now when you look this man James Talbot up, you'll see that he was an Irishman who came from a noble family in Ireland. So again, another non-slave that came from Ireland who was obviously so-called black. Just by the description we just read of him being called the Crow for his black complexion. And you know what's interesting? Shakespeare was also called a crow. Okay, but I don't want to get into that right now. I'll save that for later. But anyway, this man James Talbot was obviously a so-called black Jacobite. So let's look at it. Let's look at another one. So let's read this description of a Scottish nobleman who was, of course, a Jacobite, and his name was Lord John Drummond. So let's read a little bit about John Drummond. So Lord John Drummond, who bore such a remarkable likeness to Prince Charles. Now, that is in reference to the son of James Francis that I mentioned earlier, Charles Edward Stuart. So Lord John Drummond's description as bearing a likeness to Charles Edward Stuart is a bit of an allusion to how he truly looked like, to how Charles Edward Stuart truly looked like. But I'll elaborate more on that in my series on the Stuarts. But reading on, it says a pretty jolly man of a dark brown complexion. So we can see here that Mr. John Drummond, who was a Scottish lord, was described as being a man of dark brown complexion. Obviously, the complexion of a so-called black man. And again, that last name Drummond is a very common last name for so-called blacks to have. So if you have that last name Drummond, you are most likely a descendant of the Scottish clan of Drummond, and may also be a descendant of the nobility from the Drummond clan. So let's look at one more description real quick. Let's read this description of a chief of an Irish clan known as the McPhersons. So Ewan McPherson of Clenny is of a low stature, very square, and a dark brown complexion. And so again, another Jacobite of nobility who had the complexion of a so-called black man, which of course would mean that he was indeed a black man himself. So we should have an understanding of what the Jacobites looked like, with a lot of them being so-called black, both the Jacobites of nobility as well as the ones who weren't. And so now we should have a better grasp on the other elements that occurred around this time period that led to the downfall of so-called blacks in Europe, particularly the blacks that were in rulership at the time whose power was starting to wane. In large part due to their own internal conflicts that were happening due to disputes over religion, which led to disputes over certain things like rights over specific territories, over whether or not adherence to a certain denomination of Christianity should even be on the throne, i.e., what we just talked about with King James II, and a bevy of other things that led to the dissolution of black rulership in Europe. But another factor that was coming into play, which led to the current rulership in Europe that we see today, was the rise of the so-called Caucasian, who was starting to become a much more prevalent force within Europe and was even trying to lay claim to certain titles of nobility that were not even theirs. As a matter of fact, there is an example of this that was actually recorded happening around the time period of Charles II's eventual ascendance to the throne. I just want to show you guys this example real quick before I definitively close this video out, just so that you can see that I am not lying when I make this statement. The Caucasian was literally at this moment in time trying to impersonate royalty figures like King Charles II of England to try and lay claim to the titles that he held. And I have very little to no doubt that this is one of the ways that the Caucasian rose to power in Europe. But let's just take a look at this example real quick here. So as we can see from the title of this document that I'm citing from, it's entitled Calendar of State Papers, Domestic Series of the Reign of Charles I, Volume 22. So these were actual documents that were made during the reign of King Charles I of England. And if you look below at the title, or if you look below the title at the subheading there, you can see that this is held at the Office of Public Records in Great Britain. Okay, so I just wanted to show you guys that real quick so that you guys can see that what I'm about to read from was real and was an actual documented event that actually took place. And I'm doing this as to not be accused of making this up. But let's just read what one of these documents says about this man who was trying to impersonate at the time Prince Charles II. So we'll start at the top here. So the committee of both houses to the mayor and jurates of Sandwich. So this was an actual letter that was written to the overseer of these certain counties in England. So we have received your letter brought to us by James Thurburn and by his relation concerning the person who calls himself the Prince of Wales. So this person right here was trying to bestow upon himself the title of the Prince of Wales, but was not actually the real Prince of Wales. And so let's see how they were able to ascertain that this person was not in fact the real Prince of Wales. So amongst other things, it appears that his hair is rather flaxen, or another word for a blondish color, than brown, and his complexion fair, though somewhat tanned. Now pay attention to this. The prince, talking about, of course, Prince Charles II, himself is of a black complexion and very black hair. So the real Prince of Wales, according to these people who wrote this letter, was of a black complexion, okay? A black complexion, which meant exactly what one would think it means today, and not some slightly tanned Caucasian that was a little darker than almost every other Caucasian in England or in Europe. And that is made abundantly clear when we read this document, which literally tells us that there is a difference between someone of a tan complexion that was slightly darker than the average Caucasian and someone of a black complexion who obviously today would be called a so-called black person or black man, which is how they were able to tell the difference between this imposter who was trying to impersonate Prince Charles II and the real Charles II. So let's just get that myth out of the way real quick, because that is one of the explanations that a lot of the people who are in denial about black rulership in Europe will try to use to discredit the reason for why guys like Charles II were described as having a black complexion or being literally called a so-called black man or black boy. And as we've seen thus far, Charles II was far from the only member of the Stuart royal family that was referred to as black. But we'll see more of that as I move forward with these series. But let's just read the rest of this to get the full context of what is needed. So we are fully satisfied that he is only an impostor and doth now appear of purpose to tumults and insurrections in that county, which is Kent. So this man who tried to assume the titles of Prince Charles II, who was obviously described as a so-called Caucasian, the man who was trying to impersonate Charles II, and the purpose of him doing this was to start an insurrection or uprising against the government within the county of Kent in England. So this is just one small example of, once again, the Caucasians starting to rise up against the black nobility in Europe, because stuff like this was happening all over the place in Europe, not just in England. And one of the main places where a lot of this upheaval against the so-called black rulership was taking place in was France, and that will be the location that we'll focus on in the next video, where I'll show the French Revolution. Well, I'll show how the French Revolution played a significant role in so-called black people's downfall in Europe. So we'll see that in the next video.